Hi, I'm Joschka, a medieval/early modern historian from Bern, Switzerland, and the following is a paper that I presented in early 2025, which I mentioned mainly in order to be able to tell you that you should think of it as a very early draft of an article which is later to be published in early 2026. More on that later, just something to keep in mind if you're interested in anything at all that I'm going to talk about. So, and with that out of the way, what did it actually mean to live in the Alps near the end of the Middle Ages? What do we know about that? How can we answer that? Well, one possibility, Thomas Platter, is a person who wrote an autobiography about his life in rural Valais around the turn of the 16th century. And in that he described not only his own life, but also that of his mother in a very interesting fashion. Part of that is what you can see here. So I had never seen my mother cry, because she was a brave and manly woman, with a rough demeanour. She remained a widow after her third husband died and worked like a man. She hacked, threshed and did other work, which was more the duty of men than women. So Platter summarized the life of his mother and her personality as basically being capable, hardy, providing for a family, but ultimately flawed exactly because of that, because it represented a kind of transgression against what Platter thought were some kind of obvious and strict gender boundaries. And that's despite his mother having shown him, and by the way, other women which Platter mentions in his autobiography as well, that ideas like that hardly reflected reality. And this is both interesting and important because it kind of reflects a basic problem that we have in alpine history. Because there's a distinct lack of research which investigates the female half of the population, or indeed even accounts for them in any way. Meaning quite a lot of research literature, women, gender, all of that isn't really looked at, and instead men are taken as kind of the status quo, as representing like the entirety of the population basically. And that's not only a problem because, well, it's obviously not true, but especially in the Alps, the fact is that women, their labor, their knowledge, all of that played essential roles in alpine communities, and that's what I'm going to show you in this paper. So everything that I'm going to talk about is part of my dissertation project, where I investigate in the area that you can see here, from Valais to the left or west, over Grison to Tyrol to the right, how rural communities lived in, managed and adapted to the alpine environment. And to give you a bit of an impression of what all that is based on, each point that you can see on this map stands for a community or similar entity that was involved in the sources that I've collected for my research. And these are mainly legal sources, and today I'll use them to explore this main question. How were women in or excluded by their communities? The first kind of exclusion I want to talk about is also one of the most important because it has a profound impact on both the source material and all the research that is conducted with it. And that's the exclusion of women or female terms from language. What I mean by that is the majority of sources that we have from the rural alpine area are legal texts. And those are written generally pretty much entirely in masculine form. It talks about men, gendered grammar and terms are used, and so on. But if we look closer at the sources, it's revealed that that's actually a kind of facade which hides the presence of women. Quite a lot of places. So, for example, the quote that you can see on the slide is an excerpt from a long dispute about pastures. The topic of that isn't really important because there are hundreds like these pasture disputes. What's important is the term knecht that you can see here, meaning male servant, and that term in this document shows up again and again throughout. However, near the very end of the text, we've then got this passage. The aforementioned Meier, meaning here kind of petty official, shall provide knecht and maids to do the duties of the Knechte, which were described before at length. So that means that even a seemingly clearly male term like Knecht was actually meant to include both men and women all along. And I found this kind of, for lack of a better term, slip-ups pretty much wherever I looked. For example, a village charter from around the same time period goes on at great length and detail about rules regarding different kind of herders, which is pretty common thing that a village was concerned with, so like sheep herders, pig herders and so on. And only towards the end, in a kind of aside, it specified that only capable young men and women should be hired as Hirten. Again, even in that case, only the male term was used for herders. And all of the examples that I've seen are very matter-of-factly. So they are framed in a way as though readers should take it for granted that a male term like Hirt, Knecht, should, of course, also include women. And all of that taken together means that despite women being largely not present, actually excluded from the language of sources, that's only at the surface level. And the labor of men and women were, in practice, actually often treated as largely interchangeable, as the next topic, women in and exclusion in work and communal duties, will show. So, firstly, the gemeine Arbeit. What is it? Well, the gemeine Arbeit was the duty of the members of a Gemeinde, of a village, to carry out communal work tasks. That meant mainly having to build, maintain and expand the gemeine Güter, meaning common goods, commons. That could be roads, that could be forests. In most cases, it was something to do with pastures, because pastures were quite important, because animal husbandry at the Alps, whole big thing. Anyway, doing that work was the basis for the right to actually use these commons. So if you wanted to use an Alp, well, then you'd better help repair the road going up there every year and to clean it up. Because if you didn't do so, well, you didn't actually have any right to use it. All of that is if you were a Burger or Nachbar, according to the language of the village charters, alpine charters of alpine associations and so on. So again, all terms meaning men. But what you can see now on the slide is a case where the gemeine Arbeit explicitly alternated between husband and wife. The full text of the source also shows that the wife could actually always take the place of her husband if they wanted to do so. Pretty much the only thing which wasn't allowed was sending a child of any gender or age as a work replacement. That means that a husband and a wife were treated basically like the smallest common element of the village community. One could stand in for the other, and both could represent their household in a way. And very similar systems can, with similarly explicit mentions, can also be found, for example, in the village charters of Tarch, Bichelbach and Wilton. And that is remarkable because alpine villages really relied heavily on a kind of animal husbandry, the Alpwirtschaft, because of that also the Alpen in the sense of alpine pastures, alpine cheese and so on. And for all of that, common pastures were absolutely essential, and those had to be maintained. It was a lot of work, but alpine villages generally had to carry out a lot of work, and all of that in difficult terrain with only a limited workforce and resources, because the population of those villages was typically quite small. Think at most around 50 people in most villages probably. And if you consider all of that, that means foregoing the potential labor of women because of notions about gender and propriety and something like that, well, that would have been a foolhardy luxury, something that an alpine village couldn't afford. So this case that we can see here from Burgeis, that doesn't actually show an exception, but in all likelihood it shows that an actual common practice. It's just otherwise hidden through the exclusion of women from language. This is further supported by the next couple of examples that show that women were included not only generally in communal duties, but also when it came to very strenuous physical tasks. So, what you can see here is a very rare thing. I think it might actually be pretty much unique because it's a ledger from the very early 16th century, as you can see down below. And in this ledger, a village documented the communal work tasks that they did over a period of years. In this case, it was building a road for a bridge. And they also listed, in a very detailed fashion, all the work that was carried out for that, all the material that was needed. That included additional workers, additional in the sense that they were hired or provided by village members. In total, 37 such workers are listed, and of those 37, over 21% are dien, meaning women. And it's very interesting also because there are no indications throughout the whole ledger that it's about anything but strictly construction work, meaning only the work and the materials needed for really building the road are listed. For example, we provided so many cartloads of stone, like the farmer such and such had lent us his horses so that we could carry so much lumber over to the construction site, and so on. Nothing else is mentioned, like for example foodstuffs. It's really just construction work and construction materials. And that means the only logical conclusion why women could be mentioned at all in this ledger is, well, if they actually did construction work, just like the men did, and which are listed really in a completely similar fashion. There was, however, one important difference between the work of men and women, and that's that the work of men, Knechte, was deemed as being worth 6 kreuzer per day, while for women it was only 4 kreuzer. There are, once again, a number of sources like this, not ledgers, that's really a rarity, but sources that show that women engaging in heavy physical labor weren't a rare exception, not really strange occurrence or anything like that, but really pretty common. And to offer just one additional and pretty special example, that's from Grison, the late 15th century, because there, along the very important Septimer Pass, the Septimer route, it turned out that over a period of years, pretty much all road construction and maintenance work had been carried out by women. And that was a big problem, because carrying out that road work was supposed to be the duty of the entirely male, theory, transport associations in the region. Carrying out that construction work was actually the basis for the right to transport goods at all. So it's a pretty big breach of contract. And, these male transporters swore that something like that would never happen again. They would now really do all the work themselves, never again send their wives to do the work in their stead. And a couple of years later, they reaffirmed that vow because, they were again caught in the act. And with that, I'd like to come lastly to the third aspect, sphere of in and exclusion of women after language, work, communal duties, now legal matters, legal proceedings. So when it comes to this topic, on the one hand, women were explicitly discriminated against, if not outright excluded from a lot of legal rights. That's just a fact. Just a fact. In the example that you can see on the slide here, that's a kind of hierarchy of believability, where men rested firmly on top, especially married men, and at the bottom were unmarried women. And just generally, men were deemed to be more believable than women. those kinds of hierarchies crop up more frequently in the so-called Landesordnung, meaning law codes on the level of a province or similar, so above the layer of local regulations, and it's mostly a thing or feature of the 16th century and later. But despite this kind and similar kinds of prescribed exclusion of women, in legal matters, alpine villagers were actually de facto quite willing to include women. This can be seen, for example, in the Kundschaften. That's a kind of witness statement where it's quite easy to find women either openly sending men as messengers, so like a man actually showing up and then saying, not that he now stands in for a woman or something like that, but just really openly stating, I'm only here because woman such and such sent me and she told me to tell you this. So really, it's her testimony that he relayed. So in the end, the person that was believed was the woman. And in some cases, well, women just simply testified themselves. And in those cases that I found, there are no indications that women were actually treated differently, including one case, a couple of women which acted as witnesses next to their husbands, but gave independent testimonies and also had their own act of swearing to affirm the truth of their statements. Anyway, taken all together, villagers could be quite willing to rely on the knowledge of women, especially when it profited them, needs to be said. And women could also be included in the rights to the common goods of a community. In Simplon, in the village of Simplon in Valais, for example, a portion of the profits from the communal transportation business was reserved solely for supporting women in need, a kind of primitive or early women-only social safety net, if you will. And lots more examples, lots more stuff that could be said, but in the interest of time, and as I mentioned at the start, I've also written an article, I'd like to close here with one remarkable case. So, the quote that you can see here is from the settlement of a really pretty heated dispute between two villages in Tyrol. And in cases like that, it was a widespread practice to consult local elders about rights, laws, and practices because of a lack of written documentation and because, especially in the late Middle Ages, before the rise of the so-called Polizeiordnung in the early modern era, common law, local customary law, really reigned supreme in a lot of cases. And, well, I'm just going to quote here from the source. Because of the confusion and strife of the aforementioned peasantry, they shall determine what is right and swear, that this then shall be in force forevermore. Thus both parties consulted with each other and reached an agreement, based on the instructions that they had gathered from women and men. So this means that in this case, these village communities and also outside judges which traveled to settle this dispute, treated women as legal authorities in their own right, whose word, in this case, quite literally became law, in theory, forevermore. So, to summarize and turn it a bit around maybe, firstly, the smooth running of a village community depended on the labor and the skills of women. And that's something which people back then actually acknowledged, and that really profoundly influenced both the way in which women could be in or excluded and also, well, the success of a village in the end, because as I mentioned before, there wasn't really a lot of workforce to go around, so women had to be part of it. And a certain I'm going to call it pragmatic approach to the in-exclusion of women can be seen in the way that women were included in civic duties, but probably largely excluded from the civic rights associated with those duties. Not completely. I've got cases which show that they could also get some civic rights, could access the commons. And in any case, women could use rights which, at least de jure, shouldn't have been accessible to them. And thirdly, all of that taken together means, to tie it back to Platter at the start, I don't really think that there was anything like a clearly defined or fixed border separating the genders or specific gender-based in or out groups, at least not when it came to labor and actual practice. In and exclusion, of course, that was a thing, but it's really nothing like settled categories. So even the exclusion of women from things like village charters, from language, was in all likelihood just a byproduct of the use of a generic masculinum, the generisches Maskulinum, as well, to state the extremely obvious, it hides the presence of women. And that's the case both back then or today, because it's still used today in a lot of German-speaking areas, the generisches Maskulinum. Just use male forms, and women should be thought to be part of it. Just in the background, basically, kept in the back of your mind. And also, or rather more importantly, but also that should be kept in your mind, in front of your mind, when working on the topic of women in Alpine history is, well, all of that what I've just said, they were really everywhere. They profoundly influenced Alpine societies, communities depended on them, and I'm convinced there's still a lot to be discovered. Thank you for your attention. And now, for a small addendum. If you are at all interested in this topic, well, good news. As I said at the start, this paper, it's really the very rough draft, or rather the basis of an article, which explore all of what I've just told you in greater depth with a lot more source examples and additional aspects, like, for example, a couple of women which were officially granted the legal status of men by account in what is now Grison. The article has been accepted for publication, and if all goes to plan, it should be published early in 2026 in a Journal of Medieval History. So, if you want to know more about Alpine communities and women's history, keep an eye out for that. Thanks, and have a great day.